All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. This is Search for Uhuru, Dynasty Mir, and I have the good brother, Professor Davis, with us right now. And we are going to be discussing what is Black American culture. And the reason why, Professor Davis, why I wanted to bring this up is because I get a lot of emails or comments on Dynasty, you don't appreciate Black American culture. Why? Why are you so, I guess, attached to African culture where Black America we have a great culture of our own? And so, but at the same time, I've never heard a definition or somebody point to, I would say, something that would be considered strictly Black American culture that has not been compromised or sold out. And I'm gonna give you a question. I'm gonna give you an example, and I'm gonna ask you this question, Professor Davis. Hip hop. Would you consider hip hop Black American culture? And I'm going somewhere with this.
Okay. Is that the question that we're going to start off with?
You know, if you want
Well,
to go, if we don't have to, but I
okay.
would like for you to answer that if possible throughout the conversation.
Right, right. You know what? I'm going to give a working definition of culture first of all, man. And I'm going to define it. I'm going to define culture this way: is the characteristics and knowledge of a particular group of people encompassing language, religion, cuisine, social habits, music, and arts.
Okay.
That's basically what culture is. Now, African American culture, man, is a culture that has been really defined within the context of the American experience, right? And we've been here for over 500 years. The first documented African person in what is now the United States goes back to 1513. And so, which means that we've been here for over 500 years. Now, African American culture or Black American culture is so commodified because um,
Key word,
we're in the
commodified. So continue.
right, commodified because we're in the most powerful nation on the face of the globe. And so oftentimes, for example, I got friends of mine who are from New York. And if you go to New York, there's a very, very diverse Black population there. And oftentimes, the immigrants will say, well, you know what, I'm from Antigua, Jamaica, what have you. But at the same time, they'll be enjoying hip hop culture, which is global now, and which really emerges within the context of the United States. But what happens is generally everyone kind of adopts, if you will, African American culture because African American culture is global, and it constantly changes because once it's, if you will, commodified by the entire globe, Black Americans have to reinvent something else, and that's why we're so creative. Because also too, we're the most visible Black population on the planet,
Mhm.
for better or for worse. And so everyone has a buy-in to, if you will, African American culture. Now, hip hop, for example.
Okay, go ahead. Hip hop now.
Right. I,
Go,
I,
but
I
go,
saw a
go,
special. Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No, I saw a special by Curtis Blow here. He was being interviewed on Glad TV about 6 months ago. And there were so many people who were saying that hip hop is Jamaican and because of Cool Herc and these types of things. And the way that Curtis Blow answered the question is he was asking the host of Glad, what is the most sampled musician on the musician on the planet? And that, of course, is James Brown.
Right.
Even when Cool Herc was playing at these parties in New York in the 1970s, he was sampling James Brown. And if you look at the what hip hop music is, it really is. It emerges from earlier forms of music like scatting and a lot of the earlier R&B sounds of the 60s and up into the 70s. The influence of the last poet. God, what's the gentleman's name right there? He escapes my mind. He's oh God, he said the oh God, what did he say here? He made the point it is escaping my mind right now about something that will not be televised. Anyway,
The revolution.
The revolution, right? Jill Scott, whatever his name is. Thank you. Right. And so you can see the influence of all of these people. Now, that's not to suggest in any way that hip hop was not influenced by, let's just say, Caribbean Americans and Latinos who were also a part of the population in in New York City. But what I'm saying, it is essentially an American form of music because it emerges within the United States, primarily among the urban underclass of mainly African Americans and also other immigrants. But it's fundamentally an American form of music, which has been shaped by the experiences of lower income African Americans within the boroughs of New York.
Okay, so is hip hop Black American culture?
Is hip hop Black American culture? I think. And again, there are many African American cultures.
Okay.
There are over 50 million blacks in this country.
Okay.
And there's there are the African American elites who have one culture. There are lots of middle class blacks who see life a certain way, and then there's the urban inner city. And so I would say that hip hop is kind of a subculture, right? Beginning in the poor community, the poor African American community in large urban settings. Now it has expanded, and it is global. In 2018, hip hop is now a global culture which encompasses many different cultures, but it's based around music.
Okay, so hip hop is not Black American culture. That's what you're saying.
It emerges from out of the African American tradition, and it goes global without question.
Okay, so hip hop is Black American culture.
What it merges. I mean, but today it means a lot of different things. I mean, there's hip hop in Japan, there's hip hop in Korea. So, but if you're talking about the essence of where it comes from, it's from the United States. It's from New York City, more specifically from the urban underclass. And like I say, now in 2018, it's commodified by so many different groups.
Okay, but I'm still confused because we'll say karate or I don't know, taekwondo comes from China or Japan. And just because Black people practice it it still makes it, we'll say, Chinese or Japanese culture. So
I'll say this, jazz, right?
Right.
R&B.
Correct.
These are all traditional forms of African American music styles, which really emerges from the Black American culture without question. You can include hip hop along with that. I mean, at its core, it really is. It really emerges out of earlier forms of Black American music. So, if your question is the essence of hip hop African American? Absolutely, no question about it. Has it been influenced by Caribbean immigrants coming in, like Kool Herc and Puerto Rican immigrants in New York City? Absolutely, but its essence, without question, according to Curtis Blow, is African American.
Okay.
And also too, that has been confirmed by Harvard University, because there's a complete wing, an institute at Harvard, which basically gives you the history of this music form.
Okay. So hip hop will be considered part of Black American culture. When you hear,
no question.
Okay, when I hear, I would say influencers within hip hop saying that hip hop is not Black American culture, it's the culture, and that hip hop was created by Puerto Ricans. I mean, they played a major role in creating hip hop. And again, I heard this from Busta Rhymes. Just came out with a comment saying that.
I saw that.
Who else have I heard this from? The guy who founded FUBU, Damon John. John said the same thing. Damon Dash has said the same thing on how hip hop is not Black American culture, how it's the culture, and that how Puerto Ricans played a major role in creating hip hop, What
Well,
are your thoughts on that?
sure. I can say it was it was the confluence of a variety of cultures in the Bronx and other parts of New York City that came together around, if you will, the evolution of a new type of music with young people. Uh, but according to Curtis Blow, who will be and is the president of the Universal Hip Hop Museum, which will be opening this year, according to him, and also according to oh, what's the Public Enemy? What's his name? Chuck D. According
Chuck
to
D.
Harvard University, the essence of this music is African American, without question. Now, with that said, no one in any way is minimizing Cool Herc or what's the guy's name, Grandmaster Flash, and
Correct.
others who had immigrated to New York City, man. But again, as I said before, this is an American form of music which emerges primarily in poor urban settings among African Americans. There's not an argument with that at all. There is no argument. Harvard University wouldn't argue with that. Like I say, Curtis Blow is not going to argue with the fact that it's African American in its essence.
Okay.
No one's going to argue that jazz or R&B or gospel music is not African American. It is. I mean, that's just. I mean, that's. Listen, I've been to Puerto Rico, right?
Right.
And there is no, there is no hip hop as we know it in New York.
Right.
It just doesn't exist. I've been throughout the Caribbean, Jamaica included. There is no hip hop in that sense. It just doesn't exist.
Absolutely. I agree. So what is because again, I just feel as if whatever something is black or considered to be black in regards to culture, it gets sold out, okay, and gets bought, and as you say, commodity, it turns into a commodity, I guess.
Sure,
Commoditized,
sure.
that's the correct word. And then I think because a lot of people who are, especially black people who are profiting off of black culture and want to commoditize it, that's the correct word, they start taking away from the source and saying that it's no longer black. So they won't offend the non-blacks who begin to embrace it. That's what I'm
Right.
starting to notice. So that's why I wanted you to come on and define what is Black American culture, because I feel as if whatever something is black and it becomes popular, many, especially on our end, who have no, I would say, dignity and self-respect, will put our culture on the auction block for sale in the
Right.
name of a dollar, and then argue with you when you say, well, hold on, this is our culture. No, it's not. It's the culture, and it's not black culture. That's how I
Right.
feel.
Right. And it's difficult because again, the because African Americans are part of the national American narrative, right? And so we're anchored in the country, and so whenever, how do I say this? Black African American culture is a part of the national American culture. There's just it really is impossible to separate us from, if you will, the American experience. And so we call it black culture because it emerges within the predominantly black culture, as I said before, like gospel, jazz, these types of things. And that's not to suggest that in any way it doesn't have any outside influence, because America is a melting pot of all different types of people, and so there's cultural borrowing going, one way or the other. But again, when you look at its essence, and when you look at again the history of how and what became hip hop music. You're talking about New York City, working class, poor blacks, also West Indian immigrants and Puerto Ricans and these types of things. They come together, parties, and it emerges. Now, according again to Curtis Blow, he takes it through the evolutionary process and goes back again to scatting and the earlier forms of Black American music, which influences hip hop, which actually comes about in the 1970s. So again, there's an evolutionary process, but most of those influences, man, really are centered in the African American experience in earlier forms of music that precedes hip hop.
Mm. No, exactly, and I completely agree. So, what else will be considered Black American culture?
Well, there's a lot of stuff, man. I mean, certain forms of slang, of course. I mean, certain religious traditions. You and I have spoken at length, man, about the historic churches that Black Americans have actually developed over the last 300 years. And one, of course, I use the African Methodist Episcopal Church as just an example, man, which, as I stated before, is the largest independent Black Protestant institution on the globe with a presence in 6 continents, man, and 20 Episcopal districts. But this is something that is uniquely African American. And this is a prime example of how African people, within the context of America, created something so they could constantly remind themselves and identify with their point of origin, which is Africa. I mean, think about this, man. Way back in the 1700s, you're going to create something. And this is before slavery was abolished, roughly 100 years before slavery was abolished. And you're going to call yourself African something, Episcopal Church, African Methodist. That is radical within itself. And this particular institution served, man, as a place where Black Americans nationally could maintain their culture and their traditions. As a matter of fact, it emerges in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the 1780s. But when Blacks began to migrate throughout the United States, one of the first institutions that they built was an AME church. That is why when you go to, for example, Seattle, Washington, the AME church has been there since the 1860s, 1870s. If you go to Utah, Montana, all of these predominantly white states, one of the first Black institutions that you're going to find is an African Methodist Episcopal Church. Imagine, for example, Dinus, Idaho is probably roughly 3% Black, right?
Right.
Tiny African American population. But if you go there, they've had an AME church there since the 1890s.
Oh wow.
Same thing with Wyoming and Utah. And again, this is one way that Blacks could maintain their culture. Now, when African Americans left the U.S. and decided to settle other places around the globe, they took the AME with them. So you find AME churches in Dominican Republic, you find them in Haiti, they're in Trinidad and Tobago, they're throughout Barbados, Bahamas, 25, 26 countries in Africa. They're in the UK, Holland, France, Germany, all over the globe, because it was a way for Black Americans to preserve or hold on to a culture that they knew in the United States.
Let me ask you this. If somebody mentioned this in the chat room. Now, since we're talking about what is Black American culture, can we connect Black American culture, whether it be music, food, back to Africa?
Well, sure, in some ways, man, because we are African people. Now, I will say this, but the style and the essence really evolved within the context of the United States. But you can see that there's a connection without question. So there isn't a disconnect. Well, and if there is, man, I think that again, when a lot of Africans come to the United States, perhaps they have a difficult time merging with Black Americans because oftentimes African Americans are fundamentally Western. They're fundamentally American in their orientation, in their mindset. And so, look, I think I told you this before, man, and I'm just going to use this as a reference point in terms of, and I hate to mention slavery, but I'm going to just
No, go ahead.
try to kind of,
Go ahead.
okay, look, I often tell people that the biggest difference between, let's just say, slavery, Mexico South, and slavery in the United States and Canada is this: the Blacks who were brought to Latin America, the Caribbean, Brazil, etc. The vast majority of those slaves were African born, and they were able to to hold on to elements of their indigenous African culture. Well, the Blacks who were brought to the U.S. South, well, the difference is this: by 1825, most Black Americans were already third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation American, far removed from indigenous African culture, and so they emerged within a totally different society where they have been shaped by the American experience.
Mm.
Not the case in the West Indies. That's why even today, when you travel to Haiti, Jamaica, etc., you still find the blacks in those regions who speak a form of patois, or or language, or even some of the rituals and the
Right.
religion are close to West Africans. That's just not the case for Black Americans. Black Americans are American for the most part. I mean, there are tiny, tiny enclaves. Let's just say off the coast of South Carolina, the Geechee,
Gulagichi, right, correct.
exactly, who maintain. But the 50 plus million African Americans are Americans. We have created our own unique culture within the context of the United States through our churches, through our HBCUs, through our fraternities, sororities, so on and so forth. And I think what happens is because we are in the most powerful nation on the face of the globe, that again, we are visible across the globe. So if something negative happens to Black Americans, the whole world sees it. If something positive happens to Black Americans, the whole world sees it. I mean, for example, Brazil has 100 million Black folks. No one pays attention to Brazil because Brazil is, although it's a middle income country, it's not the United States. It's not the most powerful nation on the globe. And so people tend to know that Blacks are there, but I guarantee you, Dinas, just to make a point here, if I were to ask the average American, Black, white, of any race, to name me 10 prominent Black Brazilians, I guarantee you, I would put money on this.
Pele's one.
10.
Okay.
10.
Pele.
But
Okay.
my point is this. Dinas. If I said, Dinas, name me 10 famous African Americans, oh my God, you could go on and on and on, because again, we have hypervisibility. Most Blacks across the globe don't. And so I think, again, our culture, our music, these types of things, man, kind of shape people, and so that's what I mean. And so people may not see it as Black culture because, again, people tend to commodify it quickly. And African Americans are constantly having to kind of reinvent themselves because their culture, if you will, is shaping the entire planet.
Mm.
And that's just the reality of
it. Someone's asking in the chat room, how do you, in fact, we have two questions in the chat room. Question number one, first of all, people, can you please, as you enter the chat room, hit the like button. Please get the likes up. Please share. If you're not super chatting, that's the least you can do is hit that like button. I would greatly appreciate it. People were asking in the chat room, they said you keep bringing up the AME Church, Christianity, and that's the religion that I guess colonialized us and enslaved us. What would be your response to a question?
You know what? Okay, let me give you guys a brief history of why I do that. It's interesting too that oftentimes, yes, Christianity was used as a tool to enslave Blacks in the Western world. But let's just look at Christianity historically as a faith tradition, as it is developing within the confines of the Greco-Roman worldview. Most people don't realize that when the Christianity emerges in the first century, man, most of the major theological figures in the early church are actually African, North Africans. For example, Tertullian is African, Cyprian is African, Arnobius, Lactanticus, Athanasius, Clement, Origen. These are all North Africans who were instrumental in mapping out the structural framework of Christianity as a faith tradition. From the 1st to the 6th century of the history of Christianity, Africans basically are leading the theological influence of the church. As a matter of fact, for example, the New Testament, which there are 27 books in the New Testament, most people don't realize that we get our first complete canonical order from Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria, Egypt. And he is a little short Egyptian guy. I mean, he's roughly 5 feet tall. He's black as the ace of spades. But he gives us the first complete canonical order to the New Testament. For example, In 367 AD, Athanasius sends his festive Easter letter throughout the various churches of Alexandria, Egypt, because he's setting the date for Epiphany, which is customary. He lists the entire canon to the New Testament as we know it. The first time ever, it is an African, an Egyptian African. 30 years later, in 397 AD, St. Augustine, another African, calls together a synod, or gathering of North African bishops, and they officially ratify or close out the canon to the New Testament in North Africa. So again, historically speaking, Africans have played a leading role in the historical development of Christianity as a faith tradition. So one does not need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Now, later on, the Europeans used the Bible as a tool to kind of enslave and to marginalize African people. Absolutely. But what I'm saying, initially, as Christianity emerges as this nascent faith tradition within the Greco-Roman world, North Africans were playing the leading role in its development.
Okay, let me ask you this last question, then we're going to get back to the topic. So if that's the case, why whenever I'm in Africa are all the pictures of Jesus, white, blonde hair, and blue eyes?
Easy, very good. Because again, you're talking about the colonizers. When did the Europeans begin to colonize Africa? This was happening in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, etc., where Europeans had changed the image, if you will, of Christ.
Right.
This is why. That's why you see it. But interesting enough, I'm going to go back to the AME church. The Africans who came to the United States created their own church, separate and apart from, if you will, the white church. And they did that not because they wanted to initially, it's because that whites were excluding blacks. I mean, if you look at the history of the AME church, which was founded by Richard Allen in the 1700s, he was attending St. George's Church. He wanted to sit amongst whites. The religious leaders at the time says, no, you're going to have to sit separately with the other blacks. Allen leaves the church along with all the other blacks. They get together. They form the Free African Society. Out of the Free African Society emerges the AME Church, which is really, go ahead.
Okay, well, my question was going to be, sorry to cut you off. So in the AME Church, do they teach that Jesus is black? Like what?
Well, absolutely, because listen, and keep in mind that race is an artificial construct, first of all. Look, I tell people, I'm going to get to your answer, but I want
to. You're pulling the, why does it matter that Jesus is white?
No, I'm not at all. Not at all, man. Not at all. But to answer your question simply, yes, they do teach. But as you know, man, race is a social construct. And what I mean by that is that the physical differences that we see at the level of the phenotype are really the results of environmental adjustments, where mankind has just maximized his potential to adapt to a specific ecosystem. And so what scientists are determining is not race at all, but rather population variability, which is saying that certain groups of people share a common biohistory and a common biogeography. But if you're talking about the historic Christ, we all know, and the AME Church teaches this, was an Afro-Asiatic Palestinian Jew. So we know that this man was a person of color. And when you go in most AME churches, if you look at the icons, the Christ is clearly Africoid in his characteristics.
Okay. All right. So now the next question is, how do you feel about hip hop, a black art form or black culture now being, I would say, Europeanized or whitewashed?
Well, you know what? As I mentioned to you before, man, Curtis Blow is going to be the president of the new hip hop museum in New York, man, and he is ensuring that the hip hop basically that it's being true to its history, right? Now, clearly, you're not going to be able to kind of that's not going to be the case for everyone. I mean, whites are going to, like Eminem and others, are going to maybe see it another way. But again, I'm glad that there are elders within this new museum, which is going to be opening soon, that are passing on the history of this art form, which is now global. Because I think you well know now that hip hop is the most popular genre of music in the United States or in the world now.
In the world.
And what's fascinating about that to me, Amir, Dinas, is that it actually emerges with the poor blacks, poor West Indians and Puerto Ricans, etc. And now It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it has shaped much of the popular culture of America and the Western world, and in Africa.
But this is my issue. But we're not, I would say, capitalizing on that as Black people, like other
Well,
people. That's the issue.
well, well, I don't know if that's the case, and I honestly can't speak to what Jay Z and Puffy and Dr. Dre and Beyonce and others are doing. I am sure that they are in some ways capitalizing on it, man.
But not like
Now,
other, other people, whether it be Jews, well, white people, Jews, etc.
right, right. Well,
Which
those
are the
people have
same
had a
people,
history.
but just saying.
No, no. Well, they've had a historical advantage, man, of being the merchants, and African Americans. We can't minimize how Black Americans have been marginalized in their own country of origin. And so if it's I don't think it's fair for us to make a comparison by in terms of what whites have done or what they're doing and what, if you will, African Americans have done, because you're talking about African oranges, apples and oranges, in terms of we've been limited because of race and discrimination and these types of
Correct.
things. And sometimes we just like, well, we're not doing what whites are doing. Well, whites weren't enslaved for 250 years in this country, and they weren't terrorized for 450 years. And
Correct.
so, again, our narrative is just unique. And people, I constantly tell folks, Dinus, that again, Black Americans are the most unique population in the United States. You cannot compare us to anybody. We're in a class all by ourselves.
Mhm.
It's just we just have a completely different narrative than folks who voluntarily got on a plane or a boat and came here.
Mm. All right. Someone's asking, does the African Americans culture in America have great features that people admire globally? You already
Oh,
answered.
oh,
Go
absolutely.
ahead on that
But
some more.
listen, but not only in terms of music and art, man. I mean, science. You're gonna come up to Washington D.C., which I live outside of Washington, Maryland, and you'll get a chance to visit the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. This institution covers the more than 500-year history of the African American experience. It covers not only music, dance, and art, but science, inventions. I mean, everything, everything. Listen, and I've said this to you before, man. That, our contributions to this country are really beyond belief, and it is impossible to separate America's greatness from from African Americans. I mean, George Washington Carver, for example. I mean, the fact that Benjamin Banneker laid out he surveyed the city of Washington D.C. The fact that George Washington Bush is responsible for the foundation or the founding of Washington State. The fact that George Washington Bush's son, William Owens Bush, introduces the legislation for Washington State University. Our contributions go on and on and on, man. I mean, it's just I could speak to you for the next 8 hours
Mm.
about our contributions, and I wouldn't have scratched the surface. And as I mentioned to you before, man, there's a huge Ethiopian American community in Washington D.C. And I was
Right.
sharing with them before, so with some of the younger Ethiopians, and I asked the question. I said, "Well, listen, do you happen to know who Colonel John Charles Robson is?" And they said, "Never heard of him." And then I asked them before, "Have you been to Addis Ababa?" And most of them said, "Of course we've been to Addis Ababa." And I said, "Well, there's a huge statue of Colonel Robson right downtown Addis Ababa. And Colonel John Charles Robson is the Black American who established Ethiopian Airlines in 1945. Now, Dinus,
Yes, sir.
Ethiopian Airline serves as the hub for training African pilots from around the African continent. Ethiopian Airlines is the most profitable and the most efficient airline on the African continent. And again, this particular airline was founded by Black Americans at the request at the request of Haile Selassie. Now, how huge is that? That's huge. That shows the engagement of African Americans on the African continent.
Let me ask you this, because I mean, you know, my chat room, my followers, they're very anti-Islam and Christianity. So, would you consider Christianity to be African culture or Black American culture, like
Well,
from an
and
indigenous
again, let,
original?
let me just say this, man. Do you know that that one of the first theological centers of Christianity was in Africa? And it goes all the way back to the first century, right around 37 BCE.
No.
And yes, absolutely, it was in Alexandria, Egypt, man.
Okay.
And you are aware that I'm sure you've heard of Coptic Christians, right?
Correct. Out of now, the Coptic Christians come from Ethiopia, correct or no?
No, they're from Egypt.
Okay. Okay. I'm familiar.
And
And they're in
no,
Sudan.
no,
Correct. Correct.
right. I'm
Correct.
sorry.
They're in Sudan as well. Correct.
Uh, well, unfortunately, no, no, no. They were there maybe about 1,000 years ago, but with the emergence of Islam in the sixth century, sixth, seventh century, northern Sudan was colonized by the Arabs, and so if there is a Christian population in North Sudan, it's extremely tiny. Now, the Coptic Christian population in Egypt is roughly 10% of the population. That this culture goes back, my God, man, 2,000 years.
Okay,
And it was one of the,
but let me ask you this. I'm sorry to cut you off. The Coptics in Egypt, were they originally Black or Arab?
I'm glad you asked the question. Athanasius, who gives us the first complete canonical order to the New Testament, he's known by his enemies as the Black Dwarf because he's so short and dark. So to answer your question, man, prior to the conquest of Egypt by the Arabs, the Egyptians were clearly an African people. Now, keep in mind, man, Kemet, or Egypt, has been colonized by the Babylonians, the Persians, the Syrians, the Greeks, the Romans. You have successive waves of conquerors. And so the Egyptians that you see today, especially near the Mediterranean, they're, if you will, they're mulatto, they're quadroons, they're octoroons, etc. When you go south, they look like you and I, right? They're browner. They're clearly Africoid in their characteristics. Now, keep in mind, man, again, African people are phenotypically polytypic, meaning that they are variants of the African geographical population. And so, in essence, again, the Egyptians of antiquity tended to be more along the line of the elongated variant of the African geographical population.
Okay. Let's see what else you have in the chat room. Okay, Sultan had a question. Let me go to it real quick. Where's Sultan's question? What are the differences between culture, tradition, and usages? Can you address that?
You know what? A lot of it is intertwined. And I think that, and again, let me define culture again, man. Culture, is the characteristics and knowledge of a particular group of people, encompassing language, religion, cuisine, social habits, music, and art. And let me just say this to you again, man. I want to make this point clear. In the 21st century, right? Many cultures are now transnational because of social media, because of transportation, communication. You follow what I'm saying?
Right.
Cultures are always changing, and they are borrowing back and forth. And so, maybe 150 years ago or 200 years ago, that was not the case because we didn't have the technological advances. And so now it's a much more complicated. But still, I think that I'm going to take China, for example, which China and India are the oldest continuous civilizations on the planet going back over 6,000 years. And it's interesting that those particular cultures, man, still practice their same language, religion, cuisine, so on and so forth. For example, I've been to Chinatowns all over the globe, in
Okay.
Singapore,
Right.
in Vancouver, Canada, etc. And guess what, man? The Chinese that you meet in America are pretty much the same as the Chinese that you meet in Malaysia or
Correct.
Singapore. They've been able to hold on to something. But then again, too, if one wants to make a comparison between the Chinese and, let's just say, African people, they weren't the product of chattel, and they weren't scattered across the globe for to be the laborers of the world. And so they still have that cultural continuity.
Correct. Okay, let's see what else we got in the chat room. So I mean, let's deal with the food. As far as being Black culture, how do you feel about soul food? Is soul food Black American culture? Is that something we should be proud of?
You
As far
know
as
what?
chitlin and all that. Like, what's your thought on that?
I'll say this, man. As Black Americans have emerged from the days of oppression into the 21st century, when you know better, you do better, right?
Right.
And so I think that there are now where I live here in Maryland, there are organic African American restaurants
Mm-hmm.
that serve food that's healthy for you. So I think that way back in the day, I understood or understand why Black Americans ate what they ate. I mean,
Correct.
you had to if you wanted to survive. But what I would say is that certain things about all cultures we can eliminate, especially if it's not healthy for you.
Correct. Okay. I could completely understand and follow you on that one.
Mhm.
So let's deal with dress. As far as fashion, what would you consider? Now, let me ask you: are you familiar with Dapper Dan
Not too much, not too much,
or the Dapper Dave? Dapper Dan. Um,
not too much.
what would you, as far as fashion, what would you consider uh Black American culture when it comes to dress?
You know what? That's actually determined by each generation,
Okay.
and also too, it's determined by class, because if you're asking the the elite blacks, well, they had been, of course, shaped by, of course, maybe some influence by white culture. If you're talking about middle class blacks, um, you know, it's really really hard to. I'll answer you this way, man. I think a lot of that has been heavily shaped by the dominant white culture,
Okay.
and maybe we've actually kind of modified it to our particular culture when we learned more about Africa and more about black cultures around the globe. But basically, I think for the most part, it's been, our trend has more or less been westernized.
Okay. See what else we got in the chat room. What? So I mean, we let's see here. Dennis, can you ask him what he considers mountain music? Somebody, y'all wants to know, what do you consider mountain music from Appalachia?
Now, you know what? Believe it or not, I saw something on NPR news not too long ago, man. There is a segment of Appalachian. There's a segment of the Appalachian population, believe it or not, man, it's black,
Uh huh.
and they've been influenced by, if you will, hillbilly music.
Okay.
So I will say this: historically, the white population in Appalachia are the descendants of the Irish and the Scots and the English who settled in those mountains. And over time, man, they use their folklore from Europe, and they develop, if you will, hillbilly or banjo type music, if you will. And so that's what you see if you go to parts of West Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee and so on and so forth. But at the same time, now I don't know a whole lot about it, but I do know that there are small enclaves of African American populations that have a similar form of music. Personally, I don't know a whole lot about it. I just don't.
Okay. All right. Now, okay. Do you consider African American or Black American to be its own ethnic group?
Oh, no question about it. We are new people. And let me share with you what I mean. And people don't tend to understand this. There are roughly 50 plus million blacks in this country. The vast majority of those blacks are what I define as domestic African Americans, folks whose ancestors have been here for hundreds of years. Now, Dinus, our ancestral mixture or amalgam, if you will, ranges from as far north as what is Mauritania, the country of Mauritania,
Okay.
spanning through Senegal, Gambia, Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon, down through the DRC or the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We also have Angolan, Mozambican ancestry, all the way right around through what is now Madagascar. There are many, as I told you before, there are many African Americans in Virginia, Maryland, New York that are of Madagascar ancestry. When I did my DNA some couple of years ago, I found out that I had Madagascar ancestry, and that I saw Skip Gates do. I'm sorry, Dr. Henry Louis Gates do a special, and he explained that Madagascar slaves were prized, and so they were brought in by the thousands to the Tidewater area of Virginia. Also, to add to that mixture of Africans, the average Black American that you see walking the street is roughly 20 to 30% European and or Native American. Now, I know a lot of African Americans don't want to hear that, and they're upset with me when I say that. The average Black American is a quarter or more white. I'm sorry, and so if your guests are upset with me by saying that, it's just the reality.
Okay.
It's just the reality of who we are, and so we are new people. We are roughly 70% African and 30% European and or Native American. And so we are definitely a different stock of people. But the beautiful thing about it is that we represent the African continent. And so when you meet an African from Northwest Africa, from the West Africa, from Central, from Southern, from Eastern Africa, basically we can actually interact with any of those people, because what? All of those groups are running through our veins. Mm-hmm. So we are new people. We are really a composite of Africa, plus some European and plus some Native American ancestry.
All right, cool. Let's see what else we got going on in the chat room. So, I mean, what else can we cover in regards to Black American culture? We covered the food.
I mean, it's food. It's the music.
Let's deal with this. Let's deal with sports. Let's deal with hockey. Now, I've heard, and I think we might have spoken on this before, that hockey was created by Black Americans who left and went to Nova Scotia. Correct?
Well,
heard that before, or?
Let me just say this to you, man. There's a book. It's not called Soul on Ice. Oh God, I can't think of the name of the book, man. But yes, and I've been to Nova Scotia, right? And I've been to Halifax. And now keep in mind that the National Hockey League in Canada forms in 1922, right? That's when it forms. However, the Nova Scotian Colored Hockey League forms in 1895, some 25 years earlier.
Okay.
And really, the core of Canadian hockey, man, has its roots in Nova Scotia, without question. and think about this, Dinas. Think about this. That is Canada's national pastime, hockey. But it was the Nova Scotians who were playing in organized teams 25 years before Canada had even started its National Hockey League. And so and also too, now most of these teams, these Black hockey teams, came from the Maritime provinces. And the Maritime provinces of Canada includes Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick. As a matter of fact, man, the first black player in the National Hockey League in Canada was Willie O'Ree. And Willie O'Ree was from New Brunswick. He was from Frederickston, New Brunswick. And interesting enough, man, he was a descendant of the Black Loyalists. Do you know who the Black Loyalists were?
I'm not, no.
Okay. The Black Loyalists were African Americans who fought on the side of the British during the American Revolution.
Okay.
And once they fought, man, the British said, listen, if you fight for us against the Americans, we'll give you your freedom. So tens of thousands of Black Americans fought. Roughly 3,000 to 5,000 ended up in Canada. And those Blacks came from Virginia, from North Carolina, from Maryland, and so on and so forth. And they migrated to Canada in the mid to late 1700s. So, to answer your question about hockey, man, no question about it. The Nova Scotians were 25 years before the national, if you will, white Canadian team. And if you watched hockey, there's something that's called the slap shot. Right. That was actually made famous by the Black Nova Scotians. If you have an opportunity to travel to the Maritime provinces, more specifically to Nova Scotia, to the Black Canadian Museum, they have a whole expose, man, about the history of blacks and their contributions to hockey in Canada.
Mm. Right.
And and this is slightly off the subject of hockey, man. I think you and I talked about Viola Desmond, who is kind of like the Rosa Parks of Canada. She is the first woman and black person who appears on the Canadian currency, and she basically she was on her way to her business meeting in New Glasgow, Canada, which is in Nova Scotia. Car broke down. Went to see a movie. The woman behind the ticket counter says, "Listen, we don't serve blacks. You can't sit in the front with whites." She did it anyway. She was in there watching the movie, and the cops came, arrested her, took her to jail. Said that she didn't pay a 1 cent tax on her tickets at the theater, and so it was just something that escalated into the civil rights movement of Canada. But just about 3 weeks ago, her younger sister, who's still alive, was basically serving as the person for displaying this brand new $10 bill, which actually recognizes Viola Desmond. And again, Mrs. Desmond was a descendant of a Black Loyalist, and the Black Loyalists were folks who originally came from the United States. Now that's huge in Canadian history, and believe it or not, man, that's a transnational example of African American culture. As a matter of fact, man, when they opened the new Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture almost 2 years ago now, well, a year and a half ago now, the government of Canada sent the contingency of Black Canadians down to celebrate with us because we have a shared history. So getting back to Black culture, man, it encompasses a lot of things. It encompasses music, it encompasses food, the traditions of our HBCUs, of course, the fraternities and sororities, a lot of things, But again, I think what happens along the way is because we as a group have hyper visibility, again, the world commodifies what is Black culture.
Let's see.
Or rather,
go ahead.
Or what is African American culture, rather.
So somebody in the chat room said, this might be a little bit off topic, but it's an important question. He feels as if Black Americans concentrate the majority of their wealth into entertainment. Is that true?
Let me just say this, man. That's a difficult question.
Per, the media.
Yeah. That's a difficult question for me to ask, man. And I just think that, again, I'm going to say this. Oftentimes, the media will portray us negatively, for better or for worse. And if we're looking for something negative about us, it's there.
Right.
But that can be countered with a lot of positive things that are going on within the African American community, man. For every negative thing that we can kind of focus on, there are just as many positive things that are going on. And again, man, Black Americans have hyper visibility. I mean, I'll say this one more time, Dynas, not to pick on anyone at all.
Go ahead.
Just for example.
Listen, let me say something, Professor Davis. You don't have to give any disclaimers if you're about to offend somebody. Go ahead and say it.
So, Dynas, again, name me 10 famous Black folks from Suriname or Guyana.
Name who?
Name me 10 famous Blacks from Guyana or Suriname.
I can't name one.
My point. That's exactly my point.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't say that to kind of belittle other groups, other diasporic Black communities, but those groups don't have the same type of representation that Black Americans have. I mean, now in some ways, people would say that is having African American privilege, and that is true to a degree. There is a privilege in having representation.
Okay, let's see what else we have in the chat room. So Music and Myas has a question, and let's see if you could address this. Are Black Americans good at sports because the strongest survived the Middle Passage and we were forced to make each other during slavery?
That's an interesting question here, and You know what? And I'm going to be very, very careful how I answer this
No, no,
question.
don't be careful. No, we don't. We're not careful, Ron.
Well, okay, this is true. This is, I'm going to say something which is not a pleasant topic, but it is true. We were bred like cattle, no question about it.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, honestly, we were bred for work. And so there is some degree of truth why African Americans tend to kind of excel in a lot of professional sports.
Uh-huh.
And I don't want to get into the race thing because again, I just think that race is it's really, like I say, an artificial construct in a
Yeah,
way.
but
I
the
think,
reality that we're living in is races
well,
plays a
you know what? Well, I think we suffer from the concept or the effects of racism, or we suffer from we suffer from the effects of the concept because I think that again, you know what? To me, again, what science is determining is not race. Science is determining population variability. Population variability says that certain groups of people share a common biohistory and a common biogeography. And we have to look at how race has been historically defined. Race has been historically defined as a division of man which share certain anthropologic traits. But the problem with that definition is that the origin of mankind is not divided, but it is monogenetic, meaning that we come from one source. And clearly this source is East Central Africa. But as these Africans begin to migrate throughout the rest of the world, they go through the process of genetic drifting. And genetic drifting is a random shift in gene frequency, which happens in isolated populations where one gene is retransmitted more than another until it becomes a completely new population. So, but again, this idea that some of these scientists stated that that Europeans were superior and Africans were inferior, that's highly problematic.
No, no, absolutely. That is problematic, but we're just dealing on when I say race, I'm just dealing specifically on skin color as far as
Right.
black, white.
Right. And again, man, if you go to Africa, man, what you're going to find is a you know is a diversity of skin shades of people who are range from cream to coal. I mean, North Africans, yes, they've been colonized by Arabs and Europeans. They're oftentimes people around the Mediterranean can be almost phenotypically the same as someone from Sicily or Greece. And then the further you go, let's just take the country of Algeria, then you begin to see people who are what they call Berbers or Amazigh is a more correct name. And these people tend to be variants of the elongated geographical African population, which is similar to the folks in Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, etc.
Okay, so but are the Berbers that are in current day Algeria, or are they the original people of Algeria?
Good question, man. Now, and again, yes, and those are the people. A lot of them, especially along the Mediterranean, have been colonized by Germans. Well, a long time ago. Let me just say this: when the western part of the Roman Empire fell to the Visigoths, these Germans crossed the Mediterranean Sea and conquered much of North Africa, and they mixed with the indigenous Africans who were there. And later on, you had the Arabs and so on and so forth. And so, what you have around the Mediterranean regions of North Africa are people who are an amalgam of African, European, and Arabs. Now, if you go into the Sahara of Algeria, those folks look like you and I. Now, and they look like some of the people who are in Ethiopia and Somalia. So, to answer your question, the indigenous Berber population were browner and darker complexion, and they're still there. Uh, Again, the further south you go into Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, you find those Berbers who are Africoid in their characteristics.
Hmm. Let's see what else we have here. So, do you think that we should create a name for Black African Americans culture so that we don't lose our culture in history with the increase of immigration into the U.S.?
Well, it's always look. Let me just say this, man. Here's what I think will happen, and it's going to be somewhat complicated. I think that the emergent group of African immigrants who are coming here and Caribbean immigrants who come here, eventually, the third generation, these folks will be African American. Eventually, over time, they will kind of merge into the general Black population.
Right.
Over time. Here's what will happen. Now, as I said to you before, of the 50 plus million Blacks in this country, the overwhelming majority of Black folks are domestic Black Americans. Mm-hmm. And guess what? Those numbers are not really going to change in a huge way. And the reason being, and this is not nice to say, listen, America really has never been really fond of a lot of Black immigrants. That's just the fact of the matter. Mm-hmm. Most of the Blacks here are the result of natural increase. African Americans having children. And keep in mind, man, that the United States outlawed the importation of Africans in 1808.
Right.
Right. And so from 1808, man, really until the 1980s, 90s, very, very few Blacks came to the United States from the Caribbean, from Africa. I mean, very few. I mean, tiny, tiny minority. And so again, that's why most Blacks in the U.S. are African American. So these immigrants coming from Nigeria, from Sierra Leone, from the West Indies.
My bad. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No worries. Second, third generation. Eventually, they will emerge into the African American population. Now, when you do go to the new Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, what we attempt to do in that museum is to cover the Black diaspora. So you will see representation from Black Americans, or indigenous Black Americans. You'll see the contributions of West Indian immigrants. You'll also see the contributions of Afro-Latinos that are in the U.S. and from recent African immigrants. But of course, most of the figures that you're going to see in the museum are folks whose ancestors who've been in the United States for hundreds of years, because that is the core of the Black population in the United States.
All right, real quick, Professor, people want to get an idea of your background. Can you go into that?
Well, what would they like to know?
What would you guys like to know in the chat room? What kind of doctor are you? What is your specialization?
Great. Right. I have a PhD in instructional systems design, post-higher secondary ed leadership. And I developed training curriculum for senior executives.
Okay. And they want to know, where were you educated?
Great. San Diego, California, Howard University, and the University of Arizona.
Okay. All right. And then have you heard of the Republic of New Africa? Have you heard of that concept before?
I've heard of it. Don't know too much about it.
Okay. All right. I mean, that's I think we covered a lot, Professor.
Well, thanks so much. And
I would say this. Go ahead. I was gonna say you can go ahead and close out and give any.
Right. And just to let your guests know too, I am multilingual. I've traveled extensively. I've been to 6 out of the 7 continents. I'll be on the 7th continent at the end of the year. And I'm finishing up 3 books now as we speak. But if anyone wants to get in contact with me, you can reach me at, and here's my email. You can reach me at Davis, Davis, L as in Larry, N as in Nicholas, 20750 @yahoo.com. And if you have any questions, please feel free to drop me an email.
Hey, let me ask this last question. I think I asked this before. I promise this is the last question.
No queries.
What do you see the future of African Americans?
Wow. Oh my God. That's a very broad and very vague question. Could you kind of contextualize it or kind of narrow it down? I mean,
a lot of people I know, is America's burning end of the empire. America's going to hell, so we have to get out. Some people are saying nothing's going to happen. We'll be fine. I mean, like, what do you foresee?
Let me just say this, man. You know, African Americans have, there's a global community of Black Americans around the world. All right. We have cousins in Canada. Our descendants are throughout the Bahamas, Trinidad and Tobago. There are literally tens of thousands of African Americans who are already living on the African continent. We've actually had a foothold in Africa for hundreds of years, literally. And so we're actually making those connections. There will always be a presence of Black Americans in America as long as there's the United States. We built the country.
Okay.
We built the country, so we're going to always be here. And again, we have engaged the African continent for a very, very long time. And so that level of engagement is always going on. We have, our institutions have been in the front line in terms of trying to improve the conditions of Africa. As I stated to you before, Dinas, Black Americans built the Ethiopian Airlines. They've actually developed or built a college, a wing of Wilberforce University in South Africa. They've also built a university in West Africa. They've also built universities in the Caribbean, in the Dominican Republic, where there are large descendants of Black Americans in Semana, and they've been there since 1824, and they were, and their travels were facilitated by Richard Allen, the founder of the AME Church. And so I think that African Americans are going to be fine. We are not only survivors, man. We have thrived, even in the face of white supremacy. We really are an amazing people. I mean, African Americans are truly, truly, truly an amazing people, and immigrants should be. And I said this to you before, man. Regardless if you're a Black immigrant, white immigrant, what have you, man, you've benefited from the legacy of the Black American experience. Period. You have benefited in a real way. So,
man, can you stay on for 10 more minutes, or do you have to go? Because I have a couple more interesting questions that I would like to ask.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, all right. Question number one: interracial dating. How do you think that would affect Black American culture?
Well, I just saw the statistics, man, in terms of marriage. Did you know, Dinas, 93% of African American women marry Black American men or Blacks?
True. Yes, correct.
And did you know that roughly 90% of Black men marry Black women?
Absolutely.
And so I think that what that shows me, this is what I believe. I don't believe that African Americans are racist in any way. I think that if you're Black and you happen to fall in love with someone of another race, then that's your own choice. But what I'm finding with the young people that I know, most people tend to kind of want to pair off with someone who is of a similar culture. I don't think that's racist. I just think that that's just the way it happens. And what's amazing to me, man, is that we've been able to kind of preserve something, and I think that I think it will continue. So, but for those who choose to marry outside of their culture, then that's just a personal choice. It doesn't bother me. That's an individual choice, and and you live and let live.
Okay, and then the other question was, I have to find it. Where's this question at? Someone just okay, so someone in the chat room said that African Americans have no culture. Hip hop is just merely entertainment. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I fundamentally disagree, man. African American culture is American culture. African American is American culture, man. So, I mean, that's just, and I'll leave it there.
All right. Well, there it is. Well, Professor Davis.
Yes.
Thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. Oh, someone in the chat room said that you speak the truth. They love everything that you're saying.
Look, all I'm doing is sharing information with people. I mean, I'm not asking anyone to agree with me because of what I'm saying. Challenge it if you want to. But to me, again, man, let me just say this one more thing. If Black Americans knew their true contributions to the United States, and I mean this, man, they would never ever be intimidated by anybody. I mean, again, man, our contributions to the United States is absolutely amazing. We
Professor, here's the question, and then you can finish. I got to ask before I forget. Because you're speaking on African Americans' contribution to building up the universe. I mean, to building up America. What have we actually gotten in return? Because we went through slavery, Jim Crow, the Reconstruction era, war on drugs. What exactly have we gotten in return for building up America? And that's the last question, I promise.
No, that's fine. And honestly, that's a great question. And what I would say to you is this, man. I think that with that, we actually have left a permanent mark in the United States. And think about this, man. This is the greatest, in my mind, one of the greatest countries in the world, even with all of our flaws. This country has a lot of issues. I'll say this. Our original sin was slavery, and of course, the annihilation of our Native American population. But here is the complexity of the United States. Everyone's trying to get here. I mean, think about this, man. There are literally millions of people living here illegally because they want to get to this country because of what it can offer. Has the United States been fair to us? No. Is there a lot more work to do? Absolutely. But again, man, what I would say is that we have to kind of stay in the fight. And I'll just say this to you too, man. No matter where you go on the planet, you're going to have issues. And let me just make a comparison real quickly, man. Brazil, which has 100 million Black people, right? And you could ask that same question to an Afro-Brazilian. What has Brazil done for you? And except for marginalize you. And that's the same with America. It has marginalized African Americans. But with that said, man, Black Americans have representation. They have created long-standing institutions in the face of all of this discrimination. And so, what have we got out of this, man? Resilience. The right man to to really shape the ideas and the opinions of the world. And you're going to always have people, man, who are going to try to kind of beat you down and say that you're not good enough. Well, again, what other nation on earth, man, has contributed or has actually surpassed the ingenuity of the United States in the 21st century? Who else? Nobody else. Much of the ingenuity has actually been created by who? African Americans. And we did it, man. I mean, in spite of all of our challenges. So if your question is what has America done, not enough, absolutely not enough. And guess what, man? Listen, we can't waste time worrying about what has not happened. We need to move forward collectively as a people, man, and just make it happen. And we need to remember this. This is exactly what our ancestors did, man. Richard Allen, when he was discriminated against, he didn't go back and say, well, what haven't whites done for us? He created something brand new. And this is, and this is just what we do as a people. Utilize that creativity, man, to overcome. So that's how I see it.
Okay, well, with that being said, everybody, thank you so much for coming on, Professor Davis. Thank you for joining us today. It's always a pleasure. Everybody, please like the video, please share, please subscribe. Make sure you go to Search for Uhuru on Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, and Facebook. Also go to searchforuhuru.com, dynastymirror.com, and also go to amazon.com. Search your name, Dynasty Mirror. Please buy a book. Professor Davis, once again, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you again soon.
All right, sir. Have a fantastic afternoon and actually a great week.
No problem. You as well.
Take care.
All right, everyone. Peace.